And if you're thinking you want a prosthetic, you need to have your prosthetic maker involved in the decision about how the surgery should go. You have to have the surgeon and the prosthetic maker talking to each other. Just because the dog uses it doesn't mean it's good for body mechanics.
Got questions about prosthetics for tripods? Get answers in our continuing discussion with Dr. Mandi Blackwelder on this episode of Tripawd Talk Radio.
Man scratching like a three-legged dog.
For any tripod, cat or dog.
Why do some vets do things that way? Why?
So many people don't realize that their dogs are in pain.
He's a three-legged dog and he's still pretty good.
Hello again from Tripawds. We're Jim and Renee, and this is Tripawd Talk Radio, episode number 122. And yes, we're talking all about rehab again. Continuing our discussion with Dr. Mandi from Healing Arts Animal Care, today we're taking a deep dive into the world of prosthetics for amputee pets. Dr. Mandi Blackwelder has been practicing veterinary medicine for more than 25 years. She is a certified canine rehab therapist with plenty of experience helping amputee dogs love life on three legs. Oftentimes, the first thing people ask about when joining Tripawds is, where can I get a prosthetic for my dog? Or what do prosthetics cost? Unfortunately, this conversation usually happens after the amputation. And as you'll learn on this episode, the best time to talk about prosthetic use is before surgery. Even better, discuss it with a board-certified orthopedic surgeon. But we don't always have the liberty of time to get the answers we need, in the case of traumatic injury, for example. So, how do you know? What dogs are the best candidates for prosthetic use? How much residual limb needs to remain for prosthetics to work? How do dogs adapt to something attached to their body? Dr. Mandi answers all this and more. So, let's hear it. Dr. Mandi, thank you for joining us again. It's great to continue this discussion.
Thanks for being here. We're so excited.
Of course. Anytime. Always happy to chat about what I do.
Yeah, well, you do a lot. And one of the things that you do is you work with prosthetics and wheelchairs in your practice. And we want to talk about that today. And we're going to specifically start with prosthetics because that's a hot topic in our community. And we would like your input on that.
We get a lot of questions about wheelchairs and prosthetics. Unfortunately, after people get the amputation, and we love to tell people it's really important to discuss that beforehand to get them to work best. But I'd like to back up just a minute and ask, can you just define prosthetics for pets? What is a prosthetic versus all of the other braces that we've seen out there, and how do prosthetics work best for animals?
Yeah, so a prosthetic is anything that replaces a part that's not there. So you could have a prosthetic finger, you could have a prosthetic leg, and pretty much anything in between. So prosthetic is just basically a replacement for, what's missing. And when I'm talking about the possibility of a prosthetic with a client, the thing that we don't get as people is that if we were to have an amputation and we were given a prosthetic, we would go, oh, look at that. It's a leg. Dogs look at that thing and they go, there's a thing and it's attached to me and it's chasing me. And that's a real different thing. So the temperament of the dog is so essential. And a lot of times the folks that want a prosthetic for their animal are really active people with really active dogs. And some of those dogs, many of those dogs are, in my opinion, better off with three legs because they often aren't the dogs that, sit and want to have something attached. They're the dogs that are, hey, I got three and I'm powerful and I'm going, and why are you slowing me down with this thing? So to me, the most important piece is the recognition of the personality of the dog. If this is a fearful dog that's a little bit spooky about the vacuum and other things like that, there's going to be a whole lot of training involved in just hey, there's a thing and it's going to follow you around, and then you have to learn how to use it. Or if you have a really active dog that doesn't have a lot of patience or manners, and sometimes people aren't aware that their dogs don't have manners. Anytime we have a prosthetic, it has to be suspended from the dog in some way. And it's not just like you snap it on there like you do with us, because if we're talking about a leg, we're straight up and down. And so gravity holds it on us. On dogs, there has to be a whole harness and apparatus that takes some time and effort to put on, and also takes some time and effort of adjustment when you're first learning. So there is a massive learning curve when it comes to prosthetics. Then to answer your what we were talking about earlier, the type of amputation is very important as well. So most veterinarians who have been trained, graduated 10 years ago or more, were trained to amputate at the hip or amputate at the shoulder and not leave a residual limb. And this was based upon the idea that dogs are going to whack that limb somewhere. And there really is no data for that. There really isn't. Really? It's just a cleaner look, right? And, if it's being amputated for cancer, a lot of times, yes, that's appropriate because you're getting the biggest margin. But otherwise, there needs to be some thought into how that goes. And if you're thinking you want a prosthetic, you need to have your prosthetic maker involved in the decision about how the surgery should go. You have to have the surgeon and the prosthetic maker talking to each other. The reason for that is most of our prosthetics require 2/3 of the lower limb remaining. So that's the middle part of the arm or the middle part of the calf, right? And so that eliminates a lot of folks, eliminates a lot of amputations. And if you fall into that category, then you have to have a surgeon that is comfortable doing that type of amputation so that the stump, the residual limb, as they call it, is appropriately padded. So if you're cutting in the middle of a bone, you have to be sure that whatever remaining muscle or tissue that you have is wrapped around that, so the dog has a little bit of a pad on the end of the bone. So there's a lot of kind of surgical pieces to this, which, again, depending on your surgeon and their openness to the concept, they may be like, it's just easier to take it all the way off, right? And there's other surgeons that are used to prosthetics. They go for it and they're like, yeah, let's figure this out.
So it's a huge topic in our community about leaving a stump or not. And like you said, in our early days of Tripawds, it was, take the whole leg as much as possible. We don't want anything flopping around. And then we're starting to see more and more vet surgeons say, no, leave it as much as possible. They need it for balance. They need it for cushioning. So you're saying that really there's no hard data to show that taking the full limb is a good thing, a better choice. But is there hard data to show that leaving a residual limb is a good thing?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, certainly I haven't done a PubMed search, so I don't know that for certain. But just in terms of physics, to me anyway, and I think to most rehab practitioners, it makes more sense that the body was meant to carry 4 legs. And so if we are now, quartered, now all that extra weight is on the other side, versus if we still have something that we can use, then we're keeping a lot of different muscles and a lot of vertebra balanced in a way that it's not when the entire limb is taken. So it doesn't mean that taking the entire limb is wrong. But to me, because in many situations it's not wrong, but to me, it's a discussion to have as far as what are my options as far as leg removal goes, right? just, I mean, if you look at it from a kind of a chiropractic standpoint, and I'm not a chiropractor, but if you look at it in terms of body balance, to me, it makes more sense to keep it. The other piece of the puzzle is that these dogs that have even half of the femur or half of the humerus left, the upper arm or upper leg, those guys, it's amazing how much they use those little nubbins. You know, I've seen a lot, like, for example, if you have a little bit, you have half of your femur remaining and it's well padded, you're going to sit square because you've got all your sits bones, right? And when you go to rock to get up, you still have a psoas muscle, which helps with your core. It helps with your balance. And those dogs still, when they move, those muscles that propel the leg are still working. So all of those sort of lower back muscles are still functioning relatively normally, even though they're not pushing the same equipment that they used to. And in forelimbs, there's a lot of dogs that have a below the elbow amputation that they play with it. They'll hold their Kong while they lick with the other paw. They dig with it. I mean, they do all kinds of stuff with their residual limb that is keeping all the back muscles stronger, all the neck muscles more balanced. So I think what we as veterinarians are learning, and kind of late in the game, if you ask me, is that we need to look at each amputation as its own thing and decide what's most appropriate for that animal's lifestyle, the owner's ability to manage. You know, if this is a dog that does end up with sores and wounds, are they going to be able to care for it, or is it better to take the whole limb? You know, finances obviously play into that. Is this somebody who would love to have a prosthetic and are aware of the challenges and expenses involved, in which case now we have a different discussion about it. Many times, as you guys well know, an amputation is a trauma-based experience, right? Dog got hit by a car or something like that. And, you know, we have a horrible fracture and there's a lot of infection and like all these things that make it like, we got to decide right now. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we in the veterinary community need to learn to have a new conversation in these moments of trauma.
That's a great segue into your, that's a great segue into your questions we had, which were like, what kind of dog is the best candidate and what do you need to know about planning for one if you do have the liberty of time? And then, but if it's cancer, you know, maybe the full amputation is best because you want to get those margins.
Yep. So in a cancer situation, I'm not an oncologist, but in a cancer situation, many times a full amputation is appropriate, particularly a bone cancer, because we want to get as big a margin as we can, as far away from the lesion as we can. So hopefully we're not leaving any cancer tissues behind. So in that case, I mean, that's an easy one. And you've got, you know, days to decide that, right? Mm-hmm. And in a trauma situation, I think it kind of falls on the veterinarian, the veterinarian staff to be able to have a conversation about, you know, let's say we have two dogs. One got hit by a car. It has no nerve innervation left in the leg at all. But this dog is not suffering from bad infection or something like that. You've got a little time to have that conversation, right? Versus another dog that got hit by a car and the leg is super mangled and they drag themselves home through the mud and the dog is potentially septic at this point. Then that's a huge nidus of infection and you may need to amputate just to eliminate infection. Like there's so many factors. And when you add the personal trauma to the whole thing, as far as, you know, the owner being in the midst of, oh my God, it really falls on the veterinarian to be the one to say, okay, here's our priorities, here's our challenges, you know, here's what we could do. And here's what it costs, and here's your involvement. And I think that's where we're quite challenged, is that many of our traumatic amputations are not being done by veterinary board surgeons because they're at an emergency clinic, and it's an emergency clinic. Conversations have to be fast. There's a lot to be done, like all of those things. And so what I would love to see is, and people going into that obviously don't have the background to be like, I listen to the tripod podcast, because they're not doing it. They don't have a tripod. So I would love to see emergency clinics have one person that's dedicated to having that, tripod conversation. Like, wouldn't that be great? So I really feel like we as veterinarians need to do a better job of discussing it, but also, there's not enough people who have any experience at all with prosthetics to be able to kind of talk about the ins and outs, So what happens is I see the dog, 6 months later, and, now we have an amputation. So I feel like there's a gap in the veterinary piece of this that needs to be filled. And unfortunately, there's not enough of us out there like me who love public speaking and get out there and be like, hey, let me tell you something. So that's that, but I feel like better education about prosthetics. I think too, a lot of veterinarians have, even if you're open-minded and up for that, a lot of veterinarians have, had an animal that was done a prosthetic by somebody who doesn't do a lot of them, and it was a unmitigated disaster, and so their one experience was a bad one, because it's hard. Prosthetics are hard to do. I mean, even me, who's done, I've been doing exclusively rehab for 10 years. I've done 5.
Wow.
So it's not necessarily, unless you have that surgeon that's advocating, it's kind of tricky. It's usually owner driven. Then the owner is trying to convince the surgeon to do it a certain way. It's very sticky. So I'm hoping that things like this, will be able to land in the hands of surgeons and emergency veterinarians to be able to go, oh, maybe I should learn a little more about that.
It's with all that veterinarians have on their plate, I feel like, oh my gosh, you guys have so much to do already. Tripawds, our community needs to be that voice to the veterinary community that says, hey, we should think about this. Just like exactly what you're describing. We need to be out there letting our vets know how we feel about this so that it just stays on top of mind. So in those panic situations with other clients, when the clients are freaking out, they remember, oh yeah, I heard about this, this community that was talking about prosthetics. Yeah. And it's interesting that you say you haven't done a lot of prosthetics. They're not that common, because that's really a different impression we get out there on social media. What the Tripawds community tends to see are lots and lots of pictures of dogs having a great time with a prosthetic. Yeah. But the reality is, like you said, they're not all that common. And one thing that we see is we see wound healing issues with a lot of people, and whether or not they wanted to have a prosthetic. If a lot of the residual limb is still there, we've had members go through amputation corrections in the past, where they just had to go back and take the whole leg because that leg was getting banged up so much. So like you said, it really pays to have a surgeon with the experience do the amputation if you decide to leave more of the limb. And it is, it's a little bit of a crapshoot, regardless of how fantastic your surgeon is. And that's, again, where conversation needs to be had ahead of time, in that, is this the dog that's going to learn how to use their limb to hold their Kong, or is this the dog that's not going to figure it out and drag it behind them, right? And so I think, and when I do a prosthetic with clients, I literally say, expect this to be a pain in the ass. I literally say that, and be really thrilled when it's not, because we all have that picture in our head of the dog running across the field in their prosthetic, yay, right? But the work that it takes to
get there until that dog has that light bulb moment of, oh, this works like my old leg. Okay. Right. Because they don't have sensation through it. They don't, it is the difference between a human and a dog is that the dog doesn't know that that's supposed to be a leg. And when that light bulb goes off, they do very well. But some dogs, that light bulb never goes off. And then it is a heavy duty training. So going back a little bit to the candidate thing, it's very much about the owner. I truly, in my practice, have had people that I have, met with, or I've heard the other half of the conversation of my reception staff. And I said, nope, not this person. I won't do a prosthetic for this person because they're all about that vision in the field, and they're not listening to, we see wounds, we see sores, we have to send it back 2 or 3 times sometimes to remold things. Because if you have an amputation in a traumatic situation, or even a non-traumatic situation where you have a residual limb, post-operatively there is swelling. Right. And so even if we cast at the amputation so that we get that prosthetic ASAP, we may have, it may be too big in 2 weeks. Right. And then we have to remold it, reshape it. And then the dog starts using it. Right. And now they build muscle. So now it has to go back because it's too small. All of those types of things. And then you add to that when we set up, when we do our casting for a prosthetic, we get the prosthetic on. This is not an articulated joint. And so the dog is having to be like, oh, okay, this is, even when that light bulb goes off, they're still like, oh, hey, I got to swing this a certain way, which means they might walk a little more on the inside of it. They might walk a little more on the outside of it. They might walk a little more to the front, to the back, whatever, which means they are now putting more pressure on the device in that area. And so they might have a sore. So I think clients, a lot of times, if they're not appropriately schooled, they go into it with the set it and forget it. Well, I made a cast, so it fits him. Well, it fits him today. We don't know how he's going to walk on it. We don't know what's going to happen as far as sizing. And so they need to be ready for it to be literally like a year-long experience to get to where we want it to be. It is a long process. Now, that said, there are those dogs that are just like, oh, thanks, and they want to go, right? But that is certainly the minority of the cases. Even the super smart border collie.
I was just going to ask you about breeds. Yes.
Yeah, the super smart border collie could be the dog that is like, oh, right on, I totally get this. Or it could be the dog that is like, no matter what you do, I'm getting this thing off because I'm so smart, right? So I don't think it so much has to do with breed as it has to do with temperament of the dog. And I'm willing to go for it with any dog as long as the owner is prepared, right?
So you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking that there needs to be an owner assessment tool for veterinarians. Does anything like that exist when it comes to prosthetics? Is there a quiz we can take? Really? We just need somebody like you.
Yes. I mean, well, actually, we should talk about that. Maybe we should brainstorm a little bit on email, because that would be a great thing to have like on your website. Like, is your dog a good candidate? Right. And we could talk about pricing because, they're not cheap, certainly.
Tell me what not cheap means. What is that?
So it depends on companies. Most of the time, a prosthetic device, the device itself is usually $1,500 to $2,500, somewhere in there. But the pieces of that is that are, where the price can really go up from there is fixing the issues. And many people think that if there's issues, it's that something was done wrong. It's that the dog is changing, right? Or that the dog is bearing weight differently. And then the rehabilitation, we have to train this dog to use it. And owners need guidance for that. Even the most dedicated owner needs guidance for that. And so the rehabilitation piece of that, it can be.
And so that piece would be like, let's say, getting a package of sessions to work with your team.
Correct.
A year. So what ballpark figure in your neck of the woods, what would something like that run?
So in Portland, Oregon, let's say you get, rehabilitation for, let's say 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at probably around $2,000 worth of rehabilitation. And the unfortunate piece of the puzzle is if your dog's light bulb isn't going off, that's all down the drain, right? And that I think is the hardest part. I mean, not a whole lot of people have $4,000 sitting around to be like, well, we'll see what happens, right? Especially after you've just spent probably more than $2,000 on an amputation, So that's the hardest part. I think as time goes on and technologies improve, this will be like, if we have this conversation in 10 years, we're going to be like, oh yeah, here's how it works. Like, it's going to be so different because people like your people are creating the demand, and where there's demand, somebody's going to fill it up. Right. So going back to, I think part of your original question too, two things. One is there are prosthetics for a full amputation. And I have never done one, but the chiropractor that works out of my office, he has a young Mastiff patient with one, and she does amazing with it. The challenge with a full limb amputation and a prosthetic is that there is no muscle to propel that leg. So the dog is having to lean and swing with their body to advance the limb, and then lean into it with their body, move the other legs, and then stand and swing again. And so it is teaching the dog to do something completely foreign that is harder in their head than 3 legs, right? So if they get it, their light bulb goes off and they're like, oh, this is what my mom wants me to do, then super, because that's easier on the rest of the body in terms of balance and things like that. But we also have to consider we're still not using a leg. We're still, throwing our vertebra to the side in order to place weight upon it. So we have to consider those pieces too. That dog may need chiropractic in the future. That dog may develop spinal arthritis in the future. If the dog's using it, it very well may save a lot of arthritis in the other limbs, but we just don't have enough of them out there, and certainly no studies or data to know, mechanically what's the most appropriate thing. Yeah.
That was just going to be my next question, because where do the benefits and the negatives intersect? When is it a better idea to just say, forget it? For a device like that, it's, I've seen rear leg amputees with prosthetics who do amazingly well over time. And we haven't had the ability to see that with front leg amputees yet with these devices. Yeah. And we'd really like to see some studies on that. Just because they're so visible now, they're so out there, and lots of people are asking about them. I don't see how an animal can do that with their bodies and not pay the price somehow over time.
Right. And we don't have those answers for sure. Yeah. Hind limb amputees are always easier, whether we're talking about how you walk as a 3-legged dog or how you or holding up a prosthetic, because you've got more angularity to it. So
what's angularity?
As far as in a back leg, you've got the foot, and then it goes up to the point of the hock, and then it goes up to the stifle, and then it goes up to the hip. You've got a lot more places where the body has a ankle that can hang on to the device. Versus the front leg's straight. And so if we're doing a prosthetic in the front, they have to have a harness. There has to be something that goes over the dog to hold it on. Versus hind limb, we can, if it's a low amputation, there can be straps that, hook up to the thigh, and, and then without a prosthetic, the front end of the dog is always more dense than the hind end, right? And particularly if you're talking deep chested dogs, Dobermans, Mastiffs, the big guys, they're all heavy in the front. And back legs, you've got the ability to crouch more in the back, all of those things. The back has a whole lot more options than the front. So if you watch a rear limb amputee go, sometimes if they're going really fast and you're not me, and who does this all the time, you might look at them and be like, that dog only has 3 legs, really? Right?
Oh, yeah.
Versus a 4-limb amputee is like boing, boing, boing. I mean, it's very obvious. Yeah. So 4 limbs are always harder. I think 4 limbs are harder for everything. They're harder to find lamenesses. They're harder for amputations. 4 limbs are just hard.
So we talked about how use of a prosthetic can be a very costly investment in time and effort and rehab. And you also talk about how the owners often don't realize that the more natural the device fits on the animal, the more likely it is to actually work for the dog. Yep. So what kind of harm can be done if the people are doing it because they see it on social media and say, oh, my dog needs a prosthetic, versus like evaluating and going into the... For example,
they have their local high school engineering crew to design something with their 3D printer, which we see.
Yeah. I think, I think, and this is true of wheelchairs as well, is just because the dog uses it doesn't mean it's good for body mechanics, right? So think about, like, for example, if it is not equal in terms of angularity and height to the other side, sure, we might have better weight bearing and maybe a little better balance, but we still have all the weight on the other side. It's like wearing a high heel shoe on one side, right? You would be wonky.
Ouch. Yeah.
And so, however, I having practiced in a small town very far from any type of specialty center, right? I think I don't discourage it per se, as long as you're sort of checking in with a trusted veterinarian. Because I think that's where these fantastic ideas come from, right? I mean, that's where having that tripod community that's pushing and saying, hey, there's a lot of us out here, folks, let's figure this out. Mm-hmm. I think that's where, genius comes from. There's a new product. It's not a prosthetic yet, but they're doing braces out of Germany. It's called Wimba. And instead of casting, you do a 3D model. And so it's really cool. The dog stands in the middle of this mat, and there's a camera on your phone that is talking to an attachment at the top of this sock that you put on the dog. And so the camera drives around in a circle around the leg and makes a 3D model with its software, and they then make the device from that.
Wow.
And their padding system is actually kind of like a honeycomb of I don't know what the material is, but so it's air-ish instead of solid material. I haven't used it yet. I'm actually working with them to do a brace for a bunny. But their idea is amazing because weight is a big factor. So that's one thing we haven't even talked about yet is little bitty dogs.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about an orthosis, a brace, or we're talking about a prosthetic, if it's heavy and you weigh 11 pounds, like that's life limiting, right? And those dogs on 3 are like, hey, I'm good. See ya. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's another factor, but I think it's that thinking outside of the box, and those high school kids that are inventing things. How are we going to strap this on the dog? Well, what if we this? Well, what if we that? I mean, I get very frustrated with fly-by-night companies that don't know anything, right? But at the same time, that sort of general, just spitballing, I think, is where we get some of our ideas. So the piece to me that's important, and there isn't a veterinarian like this in every community though, is a veterinarian who's gonna noodle it through, right? Somebody who's gonna say, okay, so you're thinking about doing this, let me think about that. And the other piece of the puzzle is owners are always going to get way further if they say, I will pay you for your time. And that's not remotely to imply that veterinarians are money grubbing pigs, as we are often accused of, but just that something like that, all the communication and the learning and all that the veterinarian who hasn't done one of these has to do is several hours. And so if they're excited about it, say, hey, let me pay you for your time and your expertise. You're going to get a better outcome that way. And
that is such a great suggestion.
Honestly, most veterinarians will be like, most of us are, if we're going to get excited about doing a prosthetic for the first time, most of the time, which we shouldn't do. But most of the time
agree.
We'll be like, no, let me look it up. I'll let you know. But at the same time, it just shows to the professional that you're working with, that you recognize that their expertise is worth something. What is often available in communities is an orthotist, somebody who does braces for humans. And that, frankly, is where all these ideas have come from. Orthopets was started by a human orthotist. And they have a real different way of looking at it than veterinarians do, because they're looking at the vectors, at the physics of what's the ground reaction force when the weight is placed here, which veterinarians, when that first was explained to me by orthopeds, I was like, do you know it took me a tutor to get through physics? Like, honestly, please don't do this. But it's very, very true that those are the most successful orthotics and prosthetics are ones where the physics are appropriately balanced.
And that's why we cringe every time we hear someone who says, oh, my husband is going to make one out of PVC. They don't understand the mechanics of the animal, let alone the physics of the thing. So what types of prosthetics are out there on the market today, and which ones are best for what type of situations?
Yeah. So I'm probably not the best expert on that, because we're a premier partner with orthopets. And so I do, almost everything through them. But I will tell you the red flags that I know of. You want a company that has an orthotist that they're working with, and it's going to be a human orthotist. There isn't such thing as a veterinary orthotist, or someone that came from a company that had a human orthotist. You want the appropriate training of the person who is designing this. And that doesn't mean that they're necessarily have their hands on every single one, but that if you have a funky case, that they have someone to go to, right? So you want that. You want, if it's something that's about casting, you want the casting done by a veterinarian. The products where they send you the casting materials freak me out. And the reason is I was a veterinarian in a poor demographic where we didn't get to do orthopedic surgeries all of that often. So I casted a lot. And I was a veterinarian for probably 3 years before I was comfortable with casting. And so the idea that I actually just had an owner in last week that he had done it. He'd done the cast himself and all that. And he was like, this is crap. This isn't going to work. And so that's when he called me, because he was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And this man was an engineer. And so he's thinking about the physics, he was thinking it through, because casting, it's the material, it's how you pull it, how tight should it be, how loose should it be, how do I get it to stick up further, all of those kinds of things. And the goal of these casts is for topography, where exactly does your ankle bone sit, how long are your toes, all of those kinds of things, that if they're inaccurate, you are not getting the most functional device. And what's more is that you're potentially creating sores and pain for your animal. Mm-hmm. So I haven't had any experience with prosthetics that were done that way, but I've had a couple of orthotics that have come to me that way, that I truly felt they fit the dog. They were on the dog anyway. But I actually, the articulation, the hinging was not in the right place. So I felt like it was doing more harm than good. And of course the owner did it themselves. So they're all excited about it. And then they think I don't know what I'm talking about. So those kind of freak me out. So that's kind of I want somebody who's had their hands in a lot of these and a lot, look at how many I've done, right? It's not tons. So, but at least somebody who's got, a few underneath them, or at very minimum, which again, because there's not a lot of us, at very minimum, somebody that's like, ooh, let's figure this. Oh, sorry. I forgot I'm on the top podcast, rubbing my hands together in excitement. Yes. They're like, oh, we're going to figure this out. And really want to dive into it with you, because you need someone to help you brainstorm who has the concept of the physics and the concept of the anatomy and all of that. So if hubby wants to build one, super, but let's be sure that he's got some consultants.
Thank you.
Absolutely. It kind of blows my mind that these casting kits are given to everyday pet parents with no experience at all. Why do you think there is no medical oversight of things like this when there is for humans? I mean, where's the governing board that says you cannot sell these direct to the public because you may harm the animal? That blows my mind. Well,
I think it's because we are in the infancy of this realm of medicine for animals. So, unfortunately, all legislation is driven by somebody suing somebody. Right? Yeah, that's where legislation comes from. And so we probably won't have that until there's some sort of disaster, unfortunately. And veterinarians as a whole are not political people. And so we gripe about things, but we don't necessarily jump in and, holler to our board. And casting material for a person, the material is all available. There's no reason that, your average person couldn't have that. And I think it's, that we are in the infancy of this. And so there's not a lot of, these devices are not FDA approved. There is no governing body basically for this. Yeah.
Well, I hope it is very tricky, and it's been really exciting since we started Tripawds in 2006 to see where things are headed. And thanks to veterinarians like yourself, we're in for better days with for pets with 3 legs.
We are, for sure.
We are. I am going to let you go on to your appointment now. This was supposed to be a show about prosthetics and wheelchairs, but your conversation about prosthetics was so fascinating. I didn't want to stop. So can we have you back for a show just on wheelchairs?
Send me another Zoom link. We'll get it all.
Okay, Dr. Blackwelder. Oh my gosh, this was such an amazing show. And we really look forward to having you back to have that other conversation about wheelchairs. Thank you so much for being here. This was really enlightening.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Dr. Mandi, thank you for your time and the work you're doing at Healing Arts Animal Care in Beaverton, Oregon. I really hope any listeners considering prosthetics are hearing this before their dog's surgery. But I know that's not realistic. So hopefully you'll heed the words of Dr. Mandi and do your homework before investing in a prosthetic for your 3-legged dog. And the best way to do that is to consult with a certified canine rehab therapist. Don't forget, the Tripawds Foundation can pay for your first consultation to determine if a prosthetic is in your pup's future, and provide plenty of exercise and treatment options if not. Learn more at tripawds.org/rehab.
Because what are you going to do? You're going to Google, and you're going to Google 3-legged dogs, and you're going to find Tripawds.
He's a 3-legged dog and he's still pretty good. 3-legged dog.
Thank you for tuning in. Subscribe to Tripawd Talk Radio for more pet amputation tips from experts, and claim your free gift just for listeners at downloads.tripawds.com/podcast.
Try